We're back now. We're starting with our first speaker. I can just see my face. Luke, are you able to put Andy on? There you are. You know what? We've had years of Zoom and still we're working it out. This is just, this is us. We're rough and ready. But I'm really excited to introduce Andy now. Andy Lester is the head of conservation for A Rocha UK. He also heads up Partners in Action, which Hazelnut is a part of. He has a degree in environmental management and green economy. And he really is a leading voice in calling for conservation throughout the UK. Those are all the facts about Andy, but let me tell you about what I know about Andy, is that Andy loves God and he is a deep encourager of people. There's a number of times when he's called me and we've connected and he's been so encouraging. And he's not about putting on a show. It's just what you see with Andy is what you get. And he's absolutely wonderful. We've really been so encouraged by Andy and by Rocha. When Hazelnut was just an idea, just a twinkle in my eye, Andy got behind it and has been supporting it. So just to say thank you to Andy for all that support in A Rocha and Partners in Action with Regina as well. So it really is with the great grace of respect that I'm honored to introduce Andy to you today. So over to you, Andy.
Thanks, John. Welcome to everybody. Great to see some people from all over the place, and especially to those from South Africa. I've got to say a big heads up to you, because I'm married to a South African, so I have a particular soft spot, but it's good to see you all. I can never figure out whether I like Zoom or not, but one or two of you will know the story that one of my last talks in person before lockdown, I was speaking at Salisbury Cathedral, and I'd already caused a bit of a stir because I'd got them to move the altar. Long story, I'll explain it another time. And just before I was due to speak, I decided to go out to the bathroom, and I accidentally knocked my radio mic into the on position. I was washing my hands. I hasten to add, I see people slightly worried what I'm going to say. I was washing my hands and I thought this is a good moment to pray for everybody. So I said, Lord, I pray that everyone stays alert and awake for the talk I'm about to bring, and that people really are inspired by it. And the Virgin knocked on the toilet door and he said, and the congregation said, Amen. So I'm always slightly nervous about recordings, microphones and Zooms. But perhaps it's easier online. At least if it goes wrong, you can pretend that you've frozen. As I watched the other day on a TV program, as the person who got embarrassed and they froze and they said, oh, we've lost the connection. So welcome to everybody. And just a couple of headlines before we start the talk and I share screen. And that is that we will rattle through relatively quickly to enable time for question and discussion at the end. If you want a copy of the presentation, you want to look at resources within the presentation, then you are very, very welcome to use them as long as they're properly attributed. So that would be all I ask, but I'll make sure that John can send that out to those who want it, as well as obviously you'll see the recording. So bear with me while I just work through the technology, and hopefully it will be pain-free. Good. Hopefully, can everyone see that? Luke, can I just have a quick thumbs up to make sure that's visible? Excellent. Thank you. After the beginning with the sound, I didn't want a visual problem as well. So the theme to start off this conference is creating spaces for nature, climate and community. And what an extraordinarily appropriate moment to have it, where right as we're speaking, the government is having another COBRA meeting to decide whether we go into a national health emergency as a result of the heat for Sunday through to Tuesday next week. If we do, for the first time in history in the UK, people will be asked to stay at home because of the weather, because of heat rather than a storm event. So we'll be watching this space, but it seems somehow appropriate, the theme of the conference, that we are in this space. And yesterday I was visiting a farm, and again, for the first time in their history, they were looking at their oat crop and starting to panic. So we recognize that the threats of climate change the impact it has on soil and on community is profound. And we will be exploring that clearly in various ways over the course of the next couple of days. So onwards. I want to start with a slide of hope. You know, it's so easy to go straight into, my gosh, look at all the things that are going wrong. But this list, which we don't need to go through, you can see it for yourself, I'll pick out a few, is a list of initiatives that are taking place right around the UK and around the world, which to me are the ones that give me perhaps the most hope. And many of you will be familiar with everything from transition towns to the concept of vertical gardening, community allotments, urban reserves, quiet zones and food forests. There's lots of stuff in there that we can engage with, that when we are feeling like there is no hope, there are definitely practical opportunities that we can all engage with at different levels. We'll be seeing more of those a little bit later on. But I wanted to theme this session around urban areas for one particular reason, and that is it's where most of us live. And here are a few facts for you. Over 55% of the world live in urban areas or cities in the UK. And in the UK, it's over 84%. So the vast majority of Brits live in towns and cities. And yet in less than 100 urban UK gardens, you can have over 5,000 species. That was a survey that was done in Sheffield just a few years ago. As we have become more urban based, we've disconnected from nature. In Britain, just 1 in 10 5 to 15-year-olds spend an hour or more outside each week. Interestingly, over the height of the COVID pandemic, that figure rose. It's since dropped again. Major cities occupy just 3% of the world's land surface area and yet use over half the planet's available resources. And you'll see that in relative terms, if you live in the UK, you're likely to have access to far more space than you will do, for example, in Asia or South America, to live and grow things in. But just as much as there are some interesting urban facts, there are some myths which it's good to dispel. The first is that urban areas are worse for wildlife than our countryside. In the UK, as well as much of Europe and North America, where we have depleted our big landscapes, it's really not the case. You can design towns and cities in a way that can be fantastic for nature, for food growing, for community. So to say that they are simply worse is misleading. Second is the concept that we are running out of space. We are not. Towns and cities are spreading. People need places to live, but it is an opportunity to make our urban spaces more creative, greener, more connected. There are far too urban conservation projects to make a difference. This is also not true. Of the list I showed you at the beginning, there are about 30 organisations in the UK alone who are engaged in urban nature conservation, community and food growing projects. Fourth, not much I can do individually to make a difference. Well, I'm not going to comment on that because you wouldn't be on this call if you believe that to be the case. And the last one is there aren't species that need our towns and cities, and clearly that is not the case either, as we will see shortly. So I want to start off with a few pretty pictures just to get us into it. And this is about why our urban landscapes are important. And a lot of A Rocha's work is at the cutting edge of nature conservation, where we're trying to create spaces that people can enjoy, but where nature abounds. So this bird's a house martin, and that nest, which it has made itself, is made up of approximately 1,100 individual drops of mud that it is painstakingly put together using saliva and water. And it goes rock hard because of an enzyme in its saliva, and it typically lays 2 to 3 eggs. And house martin gets its name because of its familiarity with urban areas. Martin actually comes from St. Martin, because one of the things it does is to arrive in southeast Greece, typically in March, coinciding with the original date of St. Martin's Day. And he was known as the patron saint of house martins because he waited for them to fly over in the spring. Familiar bird here, that is peregrine. And peregrine falcon has become a familiar sight in towns and cities right around Europe. In the UK, if you have a cathedral, you're quite likely to have a pair of these. And this one is a little egret, another species which has spread, and because of climate change, if you go into towns and parks, you're quite likely to come across them. If you're dialing in from South Africa, you'll be very familiar with the weavers, who readily associate with our urban areas on the African continent. This one you may or may not be able to see, but there's some leaves in the middle of the picture that were actually taken from a fake plastic floral posy in a church, and it picked off neatly and incorporated into the nest. So even human waste is used for nesting from some of the urban species. A true favourite of mine is bee-eater. This one was taken in Spain, and again a bird that copes incredibly well with A, climate change, and B, our towns and cities. This is a poignant picture because this picture was taken not far from a minefield in Syria. So the building behind you was bombed out just 3 days before this picture was taken, and behind the barbed wire fence was a 1 acre laid minefield. There's something wonderfully symbolic and hope-filled though about seeing a brightly coloured, rainbow coloured bird that's defying the odds stacked against it, and the odds stacked against community there. And this was taken by a local resident who exclaimed that this picture, this site, in the midst of darkness and greyness and despair and overheating, was a real symbol of hope and perseverance during times of deep struggle. And a very familiar bird to many, this is a common swift. And the common swift is one that loves our bigger towns and our urban areas. It's unique and it never lands. The male will mate on the wing, the female will land, obviously, to lay eggs. But in its lifetime, it will fly the equivalent of to the moon and back 5 to 7 times, depending on the age of the swift. So this is the longest distance flying or moving species on the planet, 5 to 7 times to the moon and back in its typical lifetime. Something even more familiar, the house sparrow, ubiquitous to our urban areas. Very briefly to some of the other wildlife. For those of you coming in from America, John and this is not a wolf but a coyote, a familiar species raiding the bins and dustbins of towns right across Canada and northern parts of the USA. Our badger, not everybody's favorite, controversial species, apex predator in Europe, does damage but also helps, and it is nevertheless, whatever your position, a beautiful creature. And a climate change challenge, the hedgehog. This is a young one that was rescued from a garden. As climate is shifting, so their hibernation patterns are changing, and hedgehog is one of many species across Europe that are in free fall decline. And many scientists believe the biggest reason for the decline is not being eaten by badgers or run over by cars, but it's because their hibernation patterns have been interrupted. And the honeybee, you know, we associate our gardens often with the birds and the mammals and the butterflies. The insects, the smaller insects, the ones that bite, the ones that sting, the ones that are a nuisance are often the most valuable. And Regina and I were coming back from Scotland a few days ago, and we did an informal splat test on our windscreens and found that the towns and cities that we travelled through where there were the most insects were in central Scotland, the Central Belt, Glasgow area. Hundreds of insects on the windscreen as we drove through it. Further south, when we drove through Birmingham and past London, absolutely nothing. So there are real challenges afoot for our insects, but a symbol of hope in the red admiral, a butterfly that has generally thrived in a season of a shifting climate. For those of you who are not so interested in the pretty and the beautiful, but want something a little bit more dangerous, it's a little bit more dangerous. This is an adult female grass snake. Many of you will know I've had a few close encounters with snakes. Grass snake is one of those that I've ended up in the water with, in a drainage ditch, in a nature reserve in Hampshire, with the two of us eyeballing each other. That's another story. But again, one that is often very reliant on the compost heaps and the hidden corners, the messy corners of our urban gardens. So what can we do? And I think for me, there is a clear starting point, and that is about taking what is broken. If we were to sit there now, and you may want to do it while you're listening, and write a list of the 10, maybe 15 things that you feel are most broken about our society, whether you're calling in from Africa or America or Europe or elsewhere, there'll be a lot of overlap. The way we have treated our planet in different guises is a clear breach of our mandate from God to be hands and feet. Now, this picture was taken at Woolfields, which is now a multi-purpose urban nature reserve in Norwood Green in West London. And a bit like Hazelnut Project, it was a dream less than 10 years ago, where the then London manager for projects and myself were prayer walking, and the Met Police had approached us and said, we want you to take on an area of broken and derelict land. And that is what we did, but we did it very reluctantly, because on that land were 55 tons of rubbish, including no fewer than 15 animal carcasses, heroin dealing, drug dealing paraphernalia, 3 sofas and 25 sheets of asbestos. But now it's got an orchard, and it's got a wildflower meadow, and it's got ponds, and it's got a little woodland area. And more importantly, it's got over 50 members of the local community volunteering from 8 different faith groups to encourage nature and rejoin the dots between growing food, local community, and caring for biodiversity. So it's all about broken pottery and restoration. And some of you will be no doubt familiar, let's go back to that image, of kintsugi. Hold that thought, because I'll explain it in a few moments. But the starting point is, let's be aware of what is broken, because if we're going to fix things and we're going to help be Christ's hands and feet in our towns and cities for nature and for community, understanding what is broken, why it's broken, and the heart of that brokenness is critical to begin to work to restore. Because if we don't know what to restore and we don't understand the problems, then we're going to really struggle to find solutions. I quite like this picture. So this is a picture back at Woolfields, taken a year after all the litter was removed. And those are some of our volunteers joining us to do a cleanup, with the addition of 1 or 2 people in that photo who've since become staff and volunteers elsewhere. They're inspired by that space and have gone on to build and develop other projects, which is hugely exciting. It's about starting vision and inspiring others to go and do the same elsewhere. And so this is where the concept of kintsugi hope comes in. And this is about understanding brokenness. And in Japanese culture, there's no such thing as a broken vase, because if it's broken, you get glue and you get gold lacquer. And you painstakingly rebuild the broken pot, the broken piece of china. And from something that was either relatively worthless, might have had some sentimental value, you create something that has incredible value. And that is about what Hazelnut is doing and what is at the heart of the A Rocha mission. It's working with others to take brokenness and bring restoration. But what it doesn't attempt to do is to iron out the cracks and to make them disappear. Because actually what makes us as individuals is our scars. It's our brokenness. It's the pain that we've gone through in our life journey to get to this place. It's those things that will inspire, equip, provide the gold from which we can then build and dream together. It's about moving from breakage to beauty, but where beauty continues to carry the scars of the past, but in a place of restoration and hope. So I want to turn fairly briefly to some initiatives. We're going to look at local, regional, national, just give you a flavour of what is going on, hopefully inspire. And then once we've looked at some initiatives, we'll then turn in at the end of the talk to looking about what does that mean for me, as in all of you out there, how can you get engaged? And so urban initiatives, we mentioned right at the beginning, our work at Woolfields Nature Reserve in West London. And I want to introduce you to this amazing group of people. On the left of the picture, you have Andre, who is a local evangelical church leader from South India. Next to him is a gentleman who was he died of COVID last year, which was a terrible loss to the site. He was a blind Sikh leader. And the last time I saw him before he died, he was hammering in a scripture, verses of Psalm 23, into our pond area to inspire people who were coming. And I said, don't you think that this is slightly unusual as a Sikh leader, that you're hammering in gospel scriptures into a nature reserve that has a Christian underpinning? I said, how do you reconcile the two? And he said to me, do you know what? Faith is all about living out what you believe. And I'm a profound believer that as a Christian community, you should be walking the walk and you should be acting for God and for nature. And I cannot think of any higher calling for a Sikh than joining you and the work that you are doing for your God and inspiring the next generation. I found that profoundly moving as somebody who didn't even know Christ and didn't have a Christian understanding. And then next to him, we have an atheist, somebody from the Baha'i religion, a Hindu, and a church leader's daughter. That is the kind of volunteer group that inspires me and I get excited by, because we can stand with the cross of Christ held high. No one is intimidated or offended by it. And some of their ideas from their own cultural heritage will deeply and profoundly enrich our own. And that's a picture a year later of an event for the local community there, including some poppy growing that a number of the volunteers had just been involved with. I'm not going to say too much about this next one, other than to say, if you want to find out more about what I think is one of the most inspiring urban community initiatives, then talk to Luke, talk to Emma, talk to John. I've been profoundly moved by the journey that Hazelnut are on. And I want to pick out one thread, and that is the word courage. We're living in a time where unless you have imagination and creativity, you will not start to change the world. But beyond imagination and creativity, you have to have courage, because you will get lots of people telling you that you can't do it. You'll get lots of funders turning around and say, unless you do this and this and this for me, we're not going to support you. You will have days where you weep at what is happening to the world. And John and I both share those ups and downs together sometimes. But Hazelnut Community is an inspirational light. It's a beacon of hope. It's a lighthouse on a hill. And its attempt now, as we're doing, to light other beacons around the world and around this nation, I hope will have a profound and lasting impact as we do go into a darker period for this planet. These pictures are taken from Germany on the left and Indianapolis in America on the right. The one on the left is all about inspiring young people with learning difficulties to encounter nature in a safe space. And the one on the right in Indianapolis is it doesn't look like a sensory garden, but it is a sensory garden full of native flowers with a focus on those who are in wheelchairs and visually impaired. Different spaces for different purposes, but all sharing one goal, which is a passionate local urban reconnection with nature. And I mentioned right at the beginning an urban initiative where they were counting species in gardens in Britain. And this was in Sheffield, in the north of England, where an area of Sheffield, the local residents decided to take away all their garden fences and replace it with a community allotment. So how on earth they've worked out land ownership, I have not a clue. But their survey a year ago found 5,000 species of wildlife in their road, many of which had moved in as a result of this community food growing initiative. So it is possible to take down fences, take down barriers, and create extraordinary spaces for nature and people simultaneously. That is inspirational. And it's not just in the UK. This is the Fuzhou urban forest in one of China's biggest growing cities. And what they have done is to create a no-walk silent space above a forest reserve where they are growing food for the community and for nature. And the idea is to create a footpath that doesn't touch the footprint of the forest. So you can wander through the forest at head height without disturbing anything that's going on below. And it still gives permission to walk, but in a totally different way. And I just find that hugely inspiring. It's a different idea. And the Chinese are incredible at new urban nature ideas. If you want inspiration, look at some of the things that China are engaged with. And finally, on the local project, this is County Durham. It's a new sensory garden initiative using raised beds. And it's what they call a minimal maintenance garden. One of the challenges that many face is as you get involved in looking after the soil and looking after land, it can be phenomenally time consuming. So this County Durham project is looking at how can you do it in church and inner city spaces where you don't have access to a large number of volunteers and where maintenance needs to be kept simple. So it doesn't have to be big and it doesn't have to be complicated. I must mention Todd Morden. I'm not going to dwell on this very long because many of you will be familiar with the incredible edible story and these towns and city projects where you're growing food in order to enable people to pick. And this is the Cheshire's Todd Morden police station with corn on the cob growing outside and a sign which you can't see in there, which they've just recently put up, which says, "Please steal them from the police station," which I've got to say, I really like the idea of going to the police station to steal. Let's move from the local to the national and catch our breath for a second. And there are some extraordinary national initiatives that have just recently started up. London's National Park City, the idea that London now pioneers a move to become a leading green light for both this nation and for Europe. The map on the top right shows an area of West London where they're wanting to reconnect 3 of the major parks by green corridors, effectively creating beelines so that insect pollinators can travel between sites across London without having to go over the roofs of many houses. And those roofs that they do go over, as you might see in the picture at the bottom, increasingly putting in green roofs to provide nature-rich corridors for species to travel on. I mentioned Todd Morden and the incredible edible network. All I'll say at this stage is if you want to find out more, Google it. They are a crazy, mad bunch of leaders, even crazier, would you believe it, than John Wight at Hazelnut. So if you think he's crazy, look at the incredible edible network, have a conversation with them. What an extraordinary program that they have been involved with. Far more familiar, transition town movement, and some of the most effective transition towns are in the most unexpected spaces. You'll see from the bottom there, which I won't go through, but just the images in Milton Keynes, land of the concrete cows, where the number of initiatives to tackle climate change and nature loss they're involved with is remarkable. Over 500 volunteers and 9 local projects through their transition town network when I last counted it. Forest schools, nationally, one of the most rapid growing initiatives to inspire our young people to get out and dirty in nature, where permission is to pick, to look, to smell, to touch, to stomp, to get muddy, to get creative, and to identify nature. And we've got several partners in action that either run or are forest schools, and they are truly spaces of wonder and inspiration. So if you're wondering what to do with your young people over the summer, there are many forest schools actively running projects. A Rocha itself runs the Eco Church program, and many of you on the call will be connected to a church that is part of this award-winning program to green your churches. And it's no surprise that actually over 70% of existing eco churches are in our towns and our cities. And if you're going for gold, John Hazelnut, a gold award winner, round of applause from everybody, very recently achieved. And that is about inspiring community. So getting out of the church and inspiring and equipping community to take action for nature through all sorts of amazing and imaginative initiatives. So what of the future? I want to start with this image, which I wish I'd come up with myself, but I haven't. And this is the concept of forest gardens or food forests. It's the idea that even in urban areas, you can create multi-layer, climate resilient landscapes that empower and equip nature and empower and equip community. Now, a lot of the food forest models have these 7 layers, canopy and trees, shrubs, herbaceous, the soil surface, and then what goes on underneath, which is critical as well, the rhizosphere, the root structure, where the trees and plants are enabled to communicate with each other, as well as binding soil carbon and holding and retaining water during times of drought. But it's also the idea of creating vertical garden spaces, vertical forest spaces up the trees, up the shrubs, and up the walls around it. And you do not need to have large areas. An urban food forest sounds like it needs to be huge. You can start with incredibly small spaces. The beauty of a landscape that is resilient like this is you're not only creating pollen and nectar producing species for insects, not only creating fruit, nuts, and vegetables for us, but you're providing fruit, nuts, and vegetables for the wildlife that is also given an opportunity and permission to eat. In other words, what you are creating is a landscape that is rich for farming heritage in an urban setting, climate resilient, forward thinking, imaginative and creative, because it can include non-native, non-invasive, obviously, species to experiment in times of climate change. So you will not necessarily have many conservationists pointing a finger and saying, no, you can't do it. But also a space where wildlife can hide, feed, and recover during times of extreme stress, whether that's drought or storms. I'm a firm believer that if you were to single out a single type of project that for me offered the most hope for our towns and cities, both in terms of nature recovery, mental health and physical health engagement, the restoration of food growing within our urban areas, and a space for permission for community to engage, adapt, and exist. It's this image here. This, for me, says it all. And if you want to find out more about 1 or 2 of the organizations engaged in creating food forests, do look at the Gardens of Eden website. I hasten to add, there's not much of it happening in the UK, but I think probably on this call is Regina Ebner. Regina is our Partners in Action Manager, and she is currently experimenting with developing a food forest at Ashburnham Christian Trust in East Sussex. She also knows a lot more about it than I do and is experimenting with all sorts of species. So it's fair to say, if you want to learn more about how to do food forests in a relatively small space and how you could do it in an urban environment, then do contact her, and I will ask John to pop her email, please, into the comment field so people can reach her, and she'll no doubt shout at me when she gets 90 people contacting her and saying, please help me to develop it. I'm also a firm believer in guerrilla gardening for wildlife and also for community. You can do things like buying patio pots where the pots are seeded already, and just depositing seeds at your neighbour's house in pots and saying, here, have some wildflowers, hanging them in community spaces, creating little pots of colour and hope that are great for pollinators. Or why not sneakily get a native flower seed bomb, and with permission and in the right space, they can be enormous fun for young people to engage with, including ones like the ones here, which are shaped like hand grenades. You pull out the plug and you chuck them, and they explode nicely on impact, or in some cases dissolve on impact. But you can make gardening for nature creative, fun, and enjoyable. It goes without saying, as somebody who's passionate about conservation, don't do it in a space where there are already a lot of native wildflowers, because it can actually make the situation worse. And don't do it unless you've got permission of the landowner. One of the beauties of urban nature is you can do ridiculous stuff in extraordinary small spaces. This is one of my favorite recent pictures of an urban site in Birmingham, where they were inspired by a talk to create a pond, where they had no garden, they had no patio, they just had a little bit of concrete where they parked their car. And so they created bucket ponds, and they've had dragonflies, and they have had all sorts of aquatic insects and some plants that they didn't even plant appear. Hugely exciting mini pond project, watching nature in action at a tiny scale. And you may think, well, that's not going to make a difference. The reality is, adding any water to a space which is not chlorine filled and not from the tap will help local wildlife. And there's a few of the organizations that are engaged worldwide in creating new space for nature. Global Bird Rescue is in the US, the Great Karoo Count, an urban project in New Zealand, and there's even a wildlife trust now focusing just on the urban. So we're moving to the tail end of the talk before we look and see if there's a little bit of time for questions and discussions. And the key here is then what happens next. So my challenge to all of you is that I believe change is possible. We can really make a difference. We can make our urban areas climate proof, entirely edible, almost entirely edible, and rich in biodiversity. I think change is also vital. We are called to be a people of direct action. Direct action can include prayer for those who can't get out, just to clarify. Change is happening. We are leaders. We are meant to be leaders and inspirers. And I don't mean leaders in the old model of standing at the front and telling others what to do, but leaders by serving and leading by service, getting your hands and feet dirty. That, to my mind, is real leadership, not managing from the front. And one big thing here is individual areas are irrelevant. And you think, what on earth do I mean by that? I'll explain it. We often think of what we do as inconsequential. But when you combine everybody's individual areas, they become something very, very beautiful, majestic, incredible. We are creating a huge painting. So when I say it's irrelevant, not relevant, what I'm meaning by this is this. If all you have is one pot to hang outside your kitchen window, it is absolutely true to say that you're not going to be having a profound impact on the direction of climate change in our world, nor the decline of house martins or the decline of wildflowers. But if you combine millions of little bits of what seem to be irrelevant actions in the eyes of government and conservation organizations and faith communities, you create something incredible, life-changing, transformative, world-moving. So yes, what I do as Andy Lester in A Rocha, I sometimes feel is entirely irrelevant, pointless, frustrating, head-bangingly difficult. But actually, when combined with Hazelnut, Caring for God's Acre, Operation Noah, and many initiatives by non-Christian organizations, and doing it together, we actually start to make a real impact. So small spaces, no garden, no problem. We can do our wild pots, we can do vertical pollination, we can do tiny mini raised beds, window box wildernesses, window feeders, mini tiny ponds, little ledge herb gardens, wall mounted bug houses. It is all possible. There's 10 ideas of what you can do in little tiny spaces. And what about for bigger spaces, for our gardens, for our churchyards in our urban areas? How do we make it more climate, wildlife resistant? Well, we let things grow. Keep 50% of your gardens, your pots, beds, or yard spaces wild. Let it flower. Don't cut the grass before the end of August. Let it produce. Plant veggies and fruit seeds from what you buy at the supermarkets, and create food growing areas and plants for birds and animals. Bring in more food resilience. Let it sing. Put up the bird boxes to provide homes for nature. Let it get wet. Create your mini wetlands without risk of little kids getting stuck in a pond, so do it carefully. Let it shine. Harness the energy and use solar and wind power where you can. Let it hide. Create those bug boxes, the bug hotels, the dead wood piles. Use it as forest school tools. And let it create, develop compost and mulch systems to create your own soil and retain moisture. So drawing to an end, this is just a slide I'm not going to read through, but it's a 10-point manifesto for change in urban spaces. Just have a quick nose through it. And all I would say is that from the small to the big, we need to be engaging not only in our own spaces, in our churches and gardens, but we also need to move to start a voice of challenge and change to our councils, to our governments, to our church denominations. And if we do that, it is possible to bring about real change to our towns and cities. And then one day, maybe our towns and cities will look more like this. This is a project that is underway at the moment, Luzhou in China, which will be populated by 30,000 people, absorbing 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide, and every year producing 900 tons of oxygen. Or a city like Nanjing, where urban nature and food growing has been taken to a new vertical level. This has actually happened already. And yes, it's fair to say that even leadership from time to time will get involved and be inspired. So it's a time for interdependency, where we need to rely not only on our trust and faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, but in each other, however irrelevant and however small we may feel our efforts are. And my final slide. We serve a God of abundance. And I just want to read this sentence from Walter Brueggemann. That journey from anxious scarcity through miraculous abundance to enabling good, being peculiarly entrusted to the church. And by the church, I'm meaning all of us on this call, not the structure of the church, the people of the church. We are called as a faith community in this season of anxious scarcity to bring about a change to miraculous, beautiful, and wonderful abundance.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andy. I'm going to help field some of the questions. So if you've been listening and there's something burning on your mind that you want to ask and get Andy to chip in on, do add those to the chat. We're going to have a chance for Andy to do that. I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of everyone. I found that really inspiring. I was involved with Hazelnut with John in Bristol, but now I'm in Hereford and we're trying to start a little community garden in our church, and just so much of what you've said is really helpful in inspiring me as we're looking at that. So I'm sure that's the case for others. And two things that really stood out to me was that that idea of courage and creativity as being, you know, the imagination that we need, but also the persistence to keep going, even in the face of what often seems quite hopeless. I feel like you've really helped introduce some hope. So thank you, Andy. Wonderful. So questions wise, we had someone who was asking how you can convince them to love dandelions, because that's what dominates their garden. They don't like to let it grow because of dandelions. What, you know, do you have any thoughts on dandelions to kick us off?
Okay, so dandelions, what can I tell you about them? So first of all, if you look up online, dandelions can form fantastic recipes for specific drinks. Dandelion and burdock is a very traditional drink. So dandelions can be used at the right time of picking as a drink, and if done well, it is stunning. The second is dandelions are often one of the only flowering plants on a cultivated lawn that persevere with mowing after mowing after mowing, and therefore often the only source of pollination and therefore nectar for our bee community. So dandelions are often helping our bees to survive. So there you go. There's lots more, but those are two to get you started with.
Another question we had was around seed companies saying you shouldn't, you know, you shouldn't be using your own seeds, or you shouldn't be using seeds from the things you're buying in the supermarket. Is that a myth that seed companies are trying to up their stuff, or is there genuine issues with what kinds of seeds you're using from a conservation?
Absolutely. So I would split this between what I would classify as fruit and veg and wildflowers. So on the fruit and veg front, there's literally nothing stopping you using the fruit and veg you've got and then creating a next generation of fruit and veg from that fruit and veg. Now, in some cases, it's designed not to be particularly fertile, so it forces you to buy more. But if it works, go for it. With wildflowers, the principle's a bit different, and that is, if there are wildflowers in a space already, it's better to manage the land for existing wildflowers than try and bring in new ones. The one exception is a plant called yellow rattle, which is semi-parasitic and will help to suppress weeds and enable an enriched grassland with more wildflowers in it. You only introduce wildflowers if you don't have a seed bank and nothing's coming in, and then you have to do so with care and ideally with local knowledge and local support.
Another question we've had is around getting hold of land, and I think this is both true in urban and rural environments, but someone here has said, for those of us in rural areas, it can ironically be harder to get land for community gardens because we're surrounded by farmland or owned by things like the Duchy. And although there's lots of discussions about community garden, there are no spare pieces of land. So do you have any advice for community groups who are wanting to grow and can't find somewhere to do that?
Indeed. So there's 3 bits of advice. The first is, if you actually own a piece of land yourself, as in a large garden, there is literally nothing stopping you turning that private space into your own community food growing space. We're into a time where we're going to have to be radical with how we use the land we ourselves manage. At the end of the day, if we believe our land that we own is God's, then opening it up for community initiatives is probably the best use of it. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, if you're part of a rural parish, there are no excuses for your church as a rural parish that are valid not to transform some of that land, some of that churchyard, some of that church garden into a space that's nature rich or rich for food growing. It can be done, even if you've got to go through all sorts of user groups to get to that point, but it's worth the perseverance. And the third is, if you don't know where to start, talk to your local MP. So you've got a rural MP who is very active. They will often help connect you to bits of disused land that they may be aware of in order for you to get started. So there'll be my 3 top tips.
Wonderful. And I know lots of, certainly in the UK, lots of farmers have quite large incentives to use some of their land for biodiversity and ecological use. So they might be delighted if you know of local farmers potentially to get in touch and say, is there ways as a community we can use some of your land for that purpose? I remember walking around Bristol with Andy and John and a few others and just explore it. John was showing us the place he thought we were going to do hazelnut, but he took us about 9 different places before. But each time it's amazing, actually, when you walk around, how many bits of land that could have projects if you contact your council and explore the opportunity. So that was great. Yeah, keep the questions coming in. I see other discussions of people talking about seed swaps and things that are going on in their communities. Somebody also, you know, as we said about dandelions, someone saying, can you convince them to be positive about brambles?
Brambles is very easy. Number one, it produces a flower which many of our solitary bee species rely on, and many insect species breed on. So without brambles, we'd be in big trouble. Obviously, we have fruit from them. And if you prune your brambles in an effective way, you will produce more fruit. Protect the flowers, protect the brambles in the right places, and you'll get fruit that's then great to eat, create jams, create drinks, and provide a source of food for small mammals. So, and also, they're great for planting in places where you don't want people to walk.
I've got I'm going to take host privileges and ask a question I've got, Andy. How, one of the themes we've sort of picked up on here is the being hopeful in the face of seeming apathy from councils or governments or members of our community. How have you seen inspiring examples, or how do you go about responding to apathy or resistance to, you know, turning an area into a wildlife garden, or to getting people on board with a community project? Do you have any advice for people wanting to energize others to support in this sort of work?
So I think the first thing is you've got to give examples of where it's happening, because a lot of people who are feeling apathetic, their first question was, no one's doing it. So the starting point is to say, they are doing it. Let me give you some examples of where it's working, and let me give you some contacts of people who are doing it, and they can then help you get your project off the ground. In much the same way, Luke, you know, in a sense, you're answering your own question, aren't you? Because you sat next to John, you've been inspired by what they're doing in the Bristol area. You're now taking on an initiative which will have a life of its own in the Midlands. But some of the early thinking and the inspiration that has come from people like John and others will be things that have inspired you, no doubt, to do what you're now doing. And so actually being part of a project that already exists and getting inspired by that is the easiest and quickest way to get people out of a place of apathy. In contrast, though, the worst thing you can do is to scare people into change. And so if the motivator is we're all doomed, and look how awful this week is, and what a disaster everything is, you will not inspire anybody to change. All it does is, you need to know the facts. This is not about burying heads in sand, but it's knowing what the facts are. We're then called to get on Noah's Ark and get ready for the rains and then start rowing, not sit there and panic. So it is about living in that space where we expect the unexpected, but see it as an adventure and a challenge, not as a place of fear and brokenness.
Mm. And someone's just said, and then pray and watch the evidence change. So
100%, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Wonderful. I don't know, John, if you've got any thoughts or comments following Andy's talk from sort of the experience of setting up Hazelnut. I realize there's going to be a session that talks more about that later on.
Yeah, I think just in terms of motivation, I think one of the things I would recommend is our potting shed course. You don't have to, I mean, it's not promoting it, it's free for people to come to, so it's not like a big promotion for us. But what I found is having a go when I felt like I was the only one doing something, and there was some doing things, there's no question, but it was just in my area and things I had connected with. It's so much different when you have other people doing it with you, and this real collaboration. We found the groups that came through, the main feedback they've said is to be able to talk and dream and hear from other people means that all of a sudden we get this really rich experience of wisdom and knowledge. And you see it even now. You say, someone say, What about dandelions? And next thing you know, you got 8 dandelion experts chipping in about dandelion wine and everything else. It's that type of shared experience and knowledge that means you can feel confident and grow much quicker. So I just recommend, collaborations and connections are really huge. The other thing is too, I think at Hazelnut, we've not chosen to just do Christian collaborations. I think we're distinctly Christian, but we see ourselves as a voice in the midst of a movement of people that are working. And so we're really happy to collaborate with lots of different groups that are doing stuff. So that's been a really key for us.
Wonderful. And we do have probably a couple more minutes if there's any final questions to chuck towards Andy or to John based on his intro time. So do say that. Otherwise, we'll probably wrap up and have a little bit of a break before we have Deborah's session later. So final chance to add to the chat. Otherwise, I guess we'll say thank you so much, Andy, for sharing all your thoughts. Earlier on, did you say it was okay to share those slides? We can, so we'll get those up on the Hazelnut website under a blog or something like that. So do go and check out the website where we'll be posting up helpful follow-up resources. Oh, we have got one more. How do you know what is the best use of the land you've been given? Yes, actually making both.
Okay, that's a whole talk in itself, and not an easy one to answer because it of course depends on the size of the land and on what it currently is being used for. But if I was to summarize it, my vision for the future are spaces both large and extremely small that fulfill our mandate to care for the planet in a way we are serving Christ in a humble and searching way. We don't have the knowledge individually to deal with the challenges ahead, but together we can experiment, we can play, we can rejoice, we can join in, we can debate. And like John had said on the dandelion wine, what you end up creating is a painting that has input from hundreds, if not thousands of people, and is way more beautiful than if alone you tried to paint it. But that takes humility. It also takes putting vision before budgets. And by that, I mean this. We need to be driven by vision, not driven by resources. Because if we are driven by vision, we can do the impossible and God will provide. It doesn't mean don't have a business plan. It doesn't mean don't have a strategy, but it does mean take risks, be prepared to put yourself out there, be prepared to make mistakes, be prepared to not look very professional sometimes in terms of outcomes, and just do it. Get your hands and feet dirty, enjoy the vision, enjoy the space, make the impossible happen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andy. What an amazing point to wrap up and end on. And Anderson asked a great question, which I think would be great. How can we be praying for you? How can we be praying for A Rocha? And then maybe I can do that. And then maybe you'd be willing to pray for this conference as we go into our other sessions throughout the next 2 days. So how can we be praying for you and A Rocha?
I think for us, it is about having the energy in this season to continue to be in a space of real hope and inspiration, because of course we're faced with two things. One is lots and lots of people wanting to do things, which is great, but it's tiring. And the second is lots and lots of data, which is pushing back against that hope and inspiration. And so we live in quite a tension of lots of opportunity and lots of struggle. And we need to be able to tap into that fuel tank that is up there with frequency in order to keep going. So I think it's for energy and also a retention of hope and adventure in the midst of some really profound challenges.
Wonderful. Well, should we close our first session in prayer? Then I'll pray for you guys, and then if you'd love to pray for the conference, that'd be brilliant.
Delighted, yeah.
So, loving Father, we thank you for this first session. We thank you for the inspiration that this talk has been, the hope that it has given, and the way in which it has caused us to delight in the good things that are already happening. And we thank you particularly for Andy and for the whole team at A Rocha, the amazing work of that organization around the world in its different local forms. We thank you for the initiatives they lead on, the way in which they inspire and empower others to make a difference and to respond with hope. And we ask, Lord, that you would pour into them the energy and the hope and the vision and the courage that is needed to continue in the mission that you've given to them. So we ask your blessing over them, that you would sustain and continue all of the stuff that they're doing and lead them into exciting new places beyond what they can even ask or imagine at this point in time. Amen.
Amen. And Father, we want to thank you for this conference, for this opportunity to listen to a range of very different voices, to be inspired by unusual things, to be able to pick up new things and experiment, to test, try out, to enjoy, to eat, to touch, to smell, to have permission to journey together. Help us above all to put a vision in you first, and help us then to work hand in hand together, not alone, so that what we produce is a tapestry that is beautiful and complex and yet at the same time unbelievably simple. Help us to create places of colour and passion and beauty that can be an inspiration to those who are lost and those who are broken, both wildlife and people alike. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you again, Andy. We've now got a 15-minute break before our next session. So grab a cup of tea, go and stand.